They were selling a woman in a town that claimed to have buried its cruelty. That was the paradox, how Cinderbrush, with its lace-curtained churches and men who tipped hats at widows, could gather in silence to bid on a breathing soul, wrapped in shame and burlap. No one looked at her long. Staring was too close to caring. The platform groaned beneath her as wind tugged at her hem. She stood with her head tilted, a sack tied snug around her crown like she was some sack of flour they'd forgotten to price. Still as a fence post, yet alert, like something inside her listened beyond the wind and the murmurs. Her wrists were bound, though not tightly, more as symbol than restraint. It was her silence that made people uneasy, not her strength. Sheriff Wexlin, his badge more rust than brass, cleared his throat and read from a yellowed scrap. Unclaimed, unspoken for. Debt settled through ownership. Name unknown. Won't speak. Maybe addled. Starting at $10. Nobody moved. The sun glinted off boot buckles and tin spittoons, but no one raised a hand. Folks shifted, muttered. A boy threw a stone that missed. Laughter rose, brittle and quick. Harlan Pike stumbled forward like a man whose feet weren't properly introduced to his legs. He was dressed in mismatched boots and smelled of sweat, horse liniment, and expired hope. "Is she a washerwoman or a banshee?" he asked, voice slurring with curiosity rather than cruelty. "Suppose I get her home and she bites me?" $5, someone jeered. "But only if the sack stays on." Elijah Boone stood at the edge of the crowd, not speaking. He'd come to town for coffee beans, horseshoe nails, and solitude. Solitude was the only thing that ever answered back. He hadn't planned to stay. He hadn't planned to watch. He was taller than most men, but quieter. People said he lived up in Whisper Pines with ghosts and trees for company, that he carved chairs no one sat in and talked to his axe like it had opinions. He was the sort of man who had once belonged to a family, but no longer spoke of them. His beard was thick, streaked with frost, though it was only late fall. His hands bore the scars of honest labor and deep loss. When the sheriff announced $3, and still no one bid, Elijah's voice, rough as gravel but deliberate, cut through the air. "2." The town hushed. $2? The sheriff asked, frowning. "Mr. Boone, you serious?" Elijah nodded once. Someone laughed, nervous and sharp. "He's buying her like firewood. Hope she burns better." But Elijah had already stepped forward, pulling coins from the pouch on his belt. The sheriff handed him a folded slip of paper, something legal-looking and insulting, and motioned to the woman. "She's yours now." Elijah approached slowly, not like a man claiming property, but like one approaching a cornered animal. He didn't reach for her. Instead, he untied the cord binding her wrists, then placed his coat over her shoulders. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't speak, but she stepped off the platform and followed him, burlap sack still hiding her face, as if by mutual understanding they had agreed not to hurry whatever truth might live beneath it. They rode out of town on Elijah's mule, side by side. No one spoke, not even Harlan, who watched them disappear down the dust-rutted road with a strange sort of reverence, as though a fairy tale had broken loose from a funeral. At first, the trail was quiet but tense. Ravens watched from the pines, and the wind whistled between gaps in the canyon like a cracked flute. Elijah said nothing. He didn't ask her name. She made no effort to give it. By dusk, the trees grew thicker, the land softer, the edges of the world smoothed out by moss and pine. His cabin stood at the heart of it all, a weathered thing with shutters like eyelids half closed in sleep. Smoke coiled from the chimney. Firewood was stacked in solemn walls along the porch. A single wooden chair faced east, carved with the grace of a man who expected no audience but made art anyway. He slid from the mule, helped her down without touching her skin. He opened the cabin door and stepped aside. She walked in, still silent. Inside, the air smelled of cedar, candle wax, and rain-damp stone. A kettle whistled faintly on the stove. A stew bubbled low. Nothing extravagant, but not cruel either. Elijah moved with purpose, lighting lamps, setting down his coat, placing a loaf of bread on the table. He carved off 2 slices, handed her one. She took it with the gentle caution of someone used to being hit after kindness. They sat across from one another, steam rising between them like smoke from a just-dug grave. He noticed the way her hands shook when she lifted the bread. Not from cold, something deeper. Shame, maybe, or rage long buried. Still, she ate. Outside, rain began to whisper against the window panes, soft and persistent. Elijah reached for a block of wood and his carving knife, turning it slowly in his hands before cutting. Shavings drifted to the floor. A fox began to emerge beneath his blade, its shape delicate and precise. She watched, her head tilted. He didn't look at her when he spoke. "You got a name?" Silence. Then, after a long while, she lifted one hand, touched the edge of the burlap sack, but did not remove it. Elijah nodded, accepting that answer too. She rose to her feet and wandered toward the fire, pausing before the mantel where small carvings stood. A bear, a bird, a pair of tiny boots. She stared at the boots a long time. Elijah did not explain them. And then she did something unexpected. She reached up and tightened the sack around her head, as if steeling herself, then sat cross-legged on the floor, her back to the fire. A figure rooted, waiting. Elijah kept carving. The fox's ears were sharp now, its eyes almost alive. A sudden gust howled down the chimney. The flames jumped. The windows rattled. But neither of them flinched. The storm gathered itself outside. Inside, a man with nothing left was carving a fox, and a woman sold for $2 was warming her hands beside a fire not built for her. Not yet. The wind moaned like it remembered everything. And the cabin, for the first time in years, held more than one kind of silence. Elijah Boone lived by the rhythm of quiet things. An axe splitting logs, the murmur of creek water under ice, the low creak of pine beams as night settled into the bones of his cabin. Days passed without names. He did not speak much to the woman, nor she to him, but something tethered them, fragile and invisible, like frost forming along a pane. She moved with the silent precision of someone who had once survived chaos and no longer trusted loudness. She swept his floor without asking. She warmed stew without tasting it. She took her meals at the corner of the table, eyes always on the fire, never on him. Each evening she sat by the hearth and unraveled pieces of herself in silence. Elijah watched only through the peripheral edges of his attention, as if to grant her privacy even while they shared the same air. She touched his carved figures one by one, never moving them, only pausing with the reverence of someone examining grave markers. The boots remained her favorite, her fingers lingering on their tiny toes as though memory were stitched into each whittled notch. He did not ask what she'd lost. He only offered her space to remember. Some days, she walked to the edge of the trees and stood staring into the forest, head tilted. The sack remained on her head, a shroud she seemed unwilling to remove. Once, Elijah left a basin of warm water by the porch, a scrap of soap beside it. The next morning, the basin was empty, the water poured clean over the roots of his wild lilacs. She hadn't washed. She wasn't ready. But he noticed the way she now ran her fingers through her hair beneath the burlap when she thought he wasn't looking. And that was something. The people of Cinderbrush forgot things quickly, like winter forgetting blossoms. But not everyone. One afternoon, as Elijah returned from chopping wood by the southern ridge, he spotted a figure perched on the fence like a buzzard with too much whiskey in its blood. Harlan Pike. His boots hung off the rail, his grin splitting his cheeks like torn leather. "Come for coffee," Harlan said, though his tone suggested something less innocent. "Or to see if your new bride breathes fire at night." Elijah rested the axe on his shoulder and didn't answer. "You reckon she's a ghost? Maybe one of them feral angels? Can't say I've seen a woman walk like that. All hush and moonlight." He chuckled. "You ever think what might be under that sack? Could be a devil's mouth, or a face so lovely it'd drive a man to ruin." Elijah set the axe down and leaned forward slowly. "She's not for your stories." Harlan squinted, mock hurt. "Ain't it funny, Boone? You spend 5 years hiding in trees, and the one thing that drags you back is a woman who won't speak and won't show her face." "Maybe that's why I trust her," Elijah said quietly, then turned and walked away. Harlan didn't follow. But that night, The woman set a second spoon down beside his bowl. She'd never done that before, and Elijah, without asking why, picked it up. The next morning, he found her in the clearing by the river, crouched low, her hands muddy and red. For one breathless second, he thought she was hurt, but as he neared, he saw what she was doing, digging with careful urgency, planting seeds from a pouch she'd taken from the cabin's forgotten drawer. Wildflower seeds. He hadn't even known they were there. She didn't stop digging when he approached. She only paused long enough to say, in a voice dry as ash but startlingly soft, "Spring." It was the first word she'd spoken. He did not ask her for another, but it planted something in him too. Days grew longer. The sack began to sag from her head as though her shame no longer needed the tightness of knots to stay hidden. Once, as rain thundered against the cabin, she lifted it slightly to wipe her mouth. Elijah turned away, offering her dignity in her secrecy. And then, one night, the knocking came. Fist to wood, deliberate, not the wind. Elijah opened the door to find Sheriff Wexlin and two men behind him. One of them a stranger in a bowler hat and shiny boots, the other with an ink-stained ledger under one arm. "We've come on account of the girl," the sheriff said. "Man here says she's his sister. Claims she ran off mad." The woman stood at the back of the cabin, motionless, the firelight flickering against her burlap mask. "She was never yours to sell," the man in the hat added. "I've traveled 3 towns over looking for her. You got no legal right." Elijah looked from them to her. Her hands were clenched tight against her thighs. Her whole frame trembled, but not with fear, with fury. "Let her speak," Elijah said, stepping aside. "Let her say who she is." "She can't," the man said. "Doesn't talk. Not since the fever. Can't tell left from right most days. But she's blood." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably, hat in hand. "She belongs with kin, Boone. You can't hold a woman who can't consent." Elijah didn't move. Then, slowly, with hands like leaves in wind, she reached up and untied the sack. What was revealed was not monstrous, nor angelic, just human. Her face bore scars, some healed, some fresh. A burn trailed from her left temple to the curve of her jaw. One eye was clouded with a silver sheen, but her mouth was firm, and her chin lifted like a woman who remembered who she used to be. "I'm not his," she said clearly. The man in the hat stepped back as if slapped. "She's lying," he said. "She don't know her own mind." The sheriff looked between them, uncertain. Elijah stepped forward, voice low. "She just remembered it." Then, to everyone's surprise, hers most of all, she added, "My name is Rosalind." It was a quiet name, but it cracked the room like thunder. The sheriff nodded once, slowly. "That's enough for me." The man in the hat cursed and stormed off. The stranger with the ledger hesitated, but followed. As the door shut behind them, Elijah turned to Rosalind, her name now a solid thing between them. She was trembling, but her hands were free. The sack lay on the floor where she dropped it. She didn't pick it up again. The next morning, the sack was gone. Elijah found it folded neatly on the porch rail, wet from dew and sagging like old skin. Rosalind sat in the wildflower clearing, her hair unbound, shoulders bared to the rising sun, like someone finally allowing warmth to touch her. She didn't turn when he approached. She didn't need to. Something between them had shifted, not loud, not sudden, but sure as thaw after frost. He brought her tea without speaking, placed the tin cup beside her knee. She nodded once. That was their language now, small offerings accepted in silence. The wildflower seeds she had planted were beginning to stir in the earth, tiny green shoots pushing through last season's decay. Life returned slowly here, but it returned. Later that day, Elijah found her in the woods, cradling a baby rabbit with a bloodied paw. She didn't ask what to do. She looked at him like someone asking if it was still safe to hope. He showed her how to wrap the paw in soft cloth, how to set it gently in a hollowed box near the fire, and how to wait. She stayed up that night beside it, whispering nothings, lullabies maybe, or memories he couldn't hear. And that was when Harlan Pike came stumbling through the tree-line with fear in his eyes and his coat flapping like a torn flag. "Elijah," he cried, wild with sweat. "Sheriff's gone. Took his wagon up north with no warning." That man, Rosalind's so-called brother. He's back. He's stirring folks, saying you're hiding a madwoman who nearly killed a child back east. He's got papers, signatures. Says you took her unlawfully, like she's some stolen mule. Elijah didn't blink. Where is he now? Coming. With others. Guns, maybe. Wants to drag her back. Rosalind stood in the doorway behind Elijah, the rabbit nestled in her arms. She heard everything, but her face didn't fall. It hardened. She set the rabbit down and stepped forward barefoot, her eyes bright with something older than fear, resolve. Elijah turned to her. If you run, I'll go with you. I won't run, she said. You might have to. She shook her head. Not again. They had little time. Elijah pulled open the chest at the foot of his bed and lifted out the rifle he hadn't touched in 5 years. The wood was worn smooth by fingers long gone, and the metal cold with memories. He hated the weight of it, but he loaded it anyway. Rosalind, meanwhile, tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. She wasn't preparing for violence. She was preparing to be seen. Fully. When the men came, they didn't knock. 5 of them, led by the man in the bowler hat, now red-faced and furious, with a pistol holstered at his hip. They approached like farmers to a chore, confident they would meet no resistance. This is your last chance, the man barked. She comes with us. Elijah stepped down from the porch. She's free. That's the only truth that matters. She's dangerous. She's human. I've got affidavits, the man shouted, waving a bundle of papers. Witnesses. She set fire to her father's barn, with her baby sister inside. The girl died. She lost her mind. I tried to save her, Rosalind said. Her voice was quiet, but the wind carried it. The clearing hushed. Even the birds fell silent. All eyes turned to her. She stood on the porch like a ghost, refusing to fade. I didn't start the fire. My father did. Drunk. My sister was hiding in the hay because he hit us both. I pulled her out. I buried her. And then I ran. The man spat. Lies. Truth, Elijah said, stepping closer, the rifle still slung but not raised. You think a woman's silence means guilt? You think shame looks the same on every face? Rosalind descended the steps slowly, barefoot, eyes locked on the man who claimed her. I wear scars you helped make, but I do not belong to them anymore. The man reached for his pistol. He never got the chance to draw it. Harlan Pike, half drunk and completely trembling, stood behind the mob with Elijah's second axe in his hands, his knuckles white. Don't, he said, his voice high and cracking. You touch her and I'll swing. I swear it, by all my foolishness and gin-soaked sins, I'll swing. A beat passed, then another. The man hesitated, and in that pause, the moment collapsed. The townsfolk who had followed out of curiosity stepped back. No one moved to take Rosalind. No one believed the bowler-hatted stranger anymore. Not against the fire in Rosalind's voice, the axe in Harlan's shaking hands, or the quiet storm in Elijah's eyes. The man cursed and turned away, hurling his bundle of papers into the dirt. She's poison. You'll see. You all will. He mounted his horse and rode out. No one followed. The others drifted away like ash after a blaze. When they were gone, Rosalind leaned against Elijah, not from weakness, but weariness. He wrapped his arm around her without a word. Harlan dropped the axe and sat heavily on a stump, breathing like he'd just outrun death itself. You think I'm a hero now? He wheezed. No, Elijah said, but you're braver than you were yesterday. Rosalind stepped forward and kissed Harlan's temple. He blinked, stunned silent for once. Spring came fully in the days that followed. The rabbit healed. The wildflowers bloomed in violent color, orange, violet, gold. Rosalind began humming as she worked, low melodies that Elijah sometimes echoed in the rhythm of his carving knife. They built a second chair. Together. No marriage papers were signed. No vows spoken. But each act between them was a declaration. Each day, a quiet choosing. In the final dusk of spring, Rosalind stood in the clearing, the sun pouring gold in her hair, her hands stained with earth and joy. Elijah watched from the porch, whittling a small wooden rabbit with a healed paw. And the wind carried a truth older than law, older than shame, that no soul, once seen and chosen in their fullness, can ever be sold again. Some people think stories like this are too soft for the world, but I say they're the bones of it. And if you're ever offered the chance to pay $2 for someone the world threw away, do it. Not to save them, but to remind them they were never broken in the first place.